Well, moving on to our criminal justice propositions. We have Prop 20. Prop 20 would make some modifications to previous propositions passed in the past decade. Currently, crimes are split between misdemeanors and felonies, felonies being the more serious crimes, which would usually involve state prison and longer term sentences. And there are some felonies that impose limits on how early a person can be released on parole, but those were modified with Prop 47 to Prop 57 because of state prison overcrowding being unconstitutional at the Supreme Court of the United States. As a result, we made some reforms to release more people on supervision and or transfer them down to local jails. What this proposition would do is it would convert some of those changes in the felony to misdemeanor pipeline back to felonies, mostly around domestic violence or shoplifting crimes. It additionally also sets parole restrictions on some of these crimes by saying that if you've been caught 3 times with a violation, the parole officer must ask for a harsher sentence. There's also an expansion of DNA sampling. Currently, DNA sampling is only for felonies. This would be extended down to property crimes, domestic violence, and forging checks. There will be increased court costs as well as law enforcement costs and jail costs for potentially adding more people back into state or local jails. Supporters have said that we've seen recently from the aforementioned earlier propositions that there has been a rise in property crimes. And as a result, we should be cracking down harder on property crimes so we can use it as a deterrent effect. And if we use DNA sampling, we could try to have a better method to identify those who've been repeat offenders. Opponents, on the other hand, say that California has been on a long trend of trying to reform its processes after having such a massive overcrowding in its state prisons, and that this just adds more money in the process at the end of a long criminal justice process rather than at the beginning when we should be working on funding healthcare or housing or rehabilitation in the first place. There has been $4.3 million spent on the supporter side and $5.8 million against. This proposition was provided by a petition funded by police unions and supermarkets. This is merely an initiative, and it will require a 3/4 amendment from the state legislature to make any modifications. Are there any questions?
No questions for this measure, no.
All right. Prop 25. Proposition 25 is a referendum. So the way it is now is that currently we have a system of cash bail. Cash bail is provided at the time between a person has been arrested and a person has gone in front of court to get tried. As a result, a cash bail requires a lot of money that people usually don't have on hand, so they get a loan from a bail bond company who usually charges around a 10% fee for providing the service. As a result, in 2018, under the guidance of the Judicial Council, which oversees the courts, the legislature passed a bill called SB 10, which would replace this cash bail system with a system based off risk assessment. However, because it's a referendum, that law has not been in effect, and instead is waiting on this proposition to pass to see if it goes into effect. As a result, this is what we have now. So Prop 25/SB10 would create a new process of setting a timeline of when a person should be released based off a risk assessment. Usually we're shortening it to span a few hours rather than necessarily waiting for people to post bail. And it would actually, for the most part, it would basically require an automatic release for most misdemeanors. The impacts of this proposition/bill is that there will be additional money required at the pretrial level so it can fund finding a risk assessment tool if they do not already have one, as well as trying to figure out who should be released quicker. On the jail side of costs, it should be reducing because there should be less people in jail. Supporters say that this bill is necessary because the current system predicates everything just based off of how much money you have rather than actually public safety, such that we have cases where if you're not guilty but you don't have the money, you'll be penalized more than a person who is guilty but has the money. And that this proposition is a ploy because the bail bond companies are funding it. Opponents, on the other hand, say that the system could actually, in some cases, to be jailed longer than it is now, and that the risk assessment algorithms themselves can be biased and may lead to greater racial inequities in the system. The supporters have contributed $8.4 million. Opponents have contributed $8.4 million to, and this proposition was placed on the ballot by bail companies. So a yes vote means you agree with the state legislature and you want to replace this cash bail system with risk assessment. A no vote would remain it as is. Are there any questions?
No questions at this time.
All right. Regulation. Katie, you're muted.
Here we are on Proposition 21, the local rent control. The way it is now is that our current law is called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act that was passed in 1994 that allows limited local rent control with three conditions. Number one, there's no rent control on single family homes. Number two, there is no rent control on newer housing that's younger than 25 years old. And number three is that if a unit goes vacant, then there's something called vacancy decontrol, and the landlord is allowed to raise the rent however they see fit. So another piece of history, in 2018, voters decisively rejected Prop 10 to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act. And then in 2019, the legislature put in place the Tenant Protection Act, which limits rent increases to 5% per year on most units. That act expires in 2030, which is why this has come up for a vote now. What this proposition does. This proposition allows localities to implement rent control on units that are older than 15 years. So it's jiggered a little bit with how old the unit can be if you want to have rent control. So now they have to be older than 15 years according to this ballot initiative. It also does three other things. There is no rent control on landlords who own 2 units or fewer. So small landlords are not rent controlled. And it removes vacancy decontrol. So it only allows a 15% increase over 3 years after a vacancy has occurred on a rental unit, on a unit that is subject to local rent control. The last thing this ballot initiative does is it codifies the fair rate of return, which was defined by courts, and this helps to protect the landlords and make sure that they make some money. Supporters say that increases in rental prices have far outpaced income growth for the last 20 years, and half of California renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing, and this puts them in the rent-burdened category. Supporters also say that housing affects everything: your education, your job security, your health, and stability for tenants, both adult tenants and children tenants. Building more housing would solve this problem, but takes time, the proponents say, and in the meantime, we need rent control. There are 17 million renters in California. Opponents say we need to increase California's tight housing supply, and the way to do that is by easing zoning and permitting processes, and that will lead us to having lower rents. This initiative is supported by the